he was bending shots beyond world champions and being asked to rescue both a nation and one of soccer's most valuable institutions. Headlines rushed to name him the heir to Lionel Messi. Brands saw a face capable of selling shirts, filling stadiums, and carrying a global story far larger than the boy himself. The cameras tried to define him through records, comparisons, and commercial promise. Lamine kept pointing back toward Rocafonda. Whenever his fingers formed the numbers 304 after a goal, the gesture carried the final digits of the 08304 postal code, the working-class neighborhood where his journey began. It was not a manufactured slogan. It was a declaration that fame could enlarge his world without earning the right to rewrite his past. By 19, after becoming a European champion and lifting the World Cup, the pressure had only grown. How does a young player protect the boy he still is, the family that raised him, and the neighborhood that shaped him, when the football world is already trying to present him as a finished product? Before the world knew the name Lamine Yamal, his journey was measured in train fares, family discipline, and, occasionally, a cup of coffee no one asked his father to pay for. Born on July 13, 2007, in Esplugues de Llobregat, Lamine Yamal Nasraoui Ebana spent his formative childhood in Rocafonda, a working-class neighborhood in the coastal city of Mataró, a short distance from central Barcelona, but far removed from the polished images found in travel brochures. Daily life there followed the practical rhythm of shift wages, school schedules, public transportation, and the constant responsibility of keeping a household together through financial uncertainty. Lamine grew up at the intersection of several identities: Spanish by birth, with Moroccan heritage through his father, and Equatorial Guinean roots through his mother. Before those origins became part of his public sporting story, they shaped the family and community, supporting his earliest ambitions. One deeply revealing memory from a neighborhood bar shows how much his first journeys depended on small acts of generosity. Juan Carlos Serrano, the owner of El Cordobés, remembered sometimes sliding a cup of coffee toward Lamine's father, Munir Nasraoui, without presenting a bill. The gesture was simple, but the few euros saved could instead help pay for the train that carried his young son to training at Barcelona's academy. It was not a grand act of charity, and no camera was there to record it. It was one working man recognizing the strain carried by another father trying to keep his child's opportunity alive. Before European stadiums were filled with supporters calling Lamine's name, people in Rocafonda were already contributing in whatever modest ways they could. Sometimes a difficult journey continues not because every obstacle has disappeared, but because someone quietly makes the next trip possible. Years later, when Lamine began forming the number 304 with his fingers beneath the lights of major stadiums, that childhood community remained visible. The gesture refers to the final 3 digits of Rocafonda's 08304 postal code, turning a local identifier into a symbol recognized far beyond Mataró. It was not merely a piece of personal branding. It was a reminder of the streets where he played, the family members who remained there, and the neighbors who had watched the journey begin before success appeared inevitable. Each celebration connected the footballer, followed by millions, with the boy whose father once needed to calculate the price of a train journey to training. The distance between Rocafonda and the largest stadiums in Europe was enormous, but the gesture suggested that distance had not erased his sense of belonging. Lamine's success also gave the neighborhood a new source of pride. Children began repeating the 304 sign. Residents saw their community represented on international broadcasts, and a postal code once known mainly to the people living there became associated with possibility. Yet the meaning remained personal before it became symbolic. Rocafonda was not simply the humble location where Lamine Yamal's story began before fame carried him elsewhere. It was the place he deliberately continued carrying with him. Every time he raised those 3 numbers toward the stands, he acknowledged that the journey had never belonged to talent alone. It had also been sustained by family sacrifice, public transportation, ordinary neighbors, and small gestures of kindness, sometimes no larger than a cup of coffee left off a bill. Inside Barcelona's academy, instinct had to become repeatable. Entering the club's youth system at around 7 years old changed the place that soccer occupied in Lamine Yamal's daily life. On the hard neighborhood pitches of Rocafonda, the game had been immediate and instinctive, shaped by the available space, the spontaneous movement of friends, and the simple pleasure of keeping the ball close to his feet. As he moved through Barcelona's development structure, that same childhood game gradually became disciplined work. Training brought tactical instruction, physical repetition, internal competition, and regular evaluation from coaches responsible for deciding whether promise could survive at the next level. His childhood did not abruptly end, but its rhythm changed. Soccer was no longer only a source of afternoon freedom. It became a responsibility that required him to return, absorb another lesson, and demonstrate that yesterday's performance could be repeated against stronger opposition. Over time, his individual style developed the recognizable patterns that would later trouble senior defenders. Operating predominantly from the right side, he learned to receive onto his favored left foot, lower his center of gravity to protect possession, disguise his intentions through small movements of the shoulders, and wait for the narrow opening that allowed him to cut inside toward the penalty area. Speed was only one part of the threat. Timing mattered just as much. So did balance, and the ability to make a defender shift his weight a fraction of a second too early. What eventually looked spontaneous beneath stadium lights had been strengthened through years of repetition on Barcelona's training fields. The public record reveals an extraordinary rise through the age groups, without requiring the narrator to invent how those years felt privately. By the spring of 2023, the distance between youth soccer and the first team had narrowed to a handful of minutes. On April 29th, Barcelona decided he was ready to enter a La Liga match against Real Betis. Lamine was only 15 years, 9 months, and 16 days old when he stepped onto the field at Camp Nou in front of more than 88,000 supporters, becoming the youngest player ever to represent Barcelona's first team in league competition. He was entering an arena shaped by adult professionals, with years of experience. Yet when the ball reached him, he did what had carried him through every previous level. He looked forward, challenged the defenders in front of him, and trusted the game he had spent most of his childhood learning to understand. 5 months later, the acceleration continued when Yamal made his senior debut for Spain against Georgia on September 8, 2023, at 16 years and 57 days old. He entered shortly before halftime, replacing the injured Marco Asensio, and became the youngest player ever to represent the Spanish national team. He then did far more than simply appear in a match whose outcome was already moving heavily in Spain's favor. Yamal scored the final goal of a 7-1 victory, becoming the youngest goalscorer in the history of the national team as well. Before he entered, Luis de la Fuente had given him a simple instruction: remain calm. Afterward, when reporters asked him to describe the historic finish, Yamal did not offer a complicated explanation about records or pressure. It was a perfect play by Nico Williams, he recalled, explaining that Nico had beaten his defender and left the ball exactly where he needed it. The response was revealing because it placed the action inside the team, rather than presenting the goal as an isolated act of individual